Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time this finds you at. This is Mr. Pinto, and I'm here with the Book of Excellence. It has been a while. It's one of those things where I keep trying to, I start, and then I don't get it done. So here are the students that have signed the Book of Excellence. We have a lot of them. Lincoln Foley, Mrs. DeFries for personal best, Piper Peabody for perseverance, and Sarita Hernandez for kindness and perseverance. Oakley Jackson from Mrs. Sheets for personal best, and Graceland Russell for effort from Mrs. Storms. Eric Vaught for kindness. Eli Capecci for friendship from Mrs. DeFries. And Maylee Hill for effort from Mrs. Storms. Nova Allen for effort from Mrs. Stolen. Emmett Powell, good job, Emmett, for respect from Mrs. Storms. Hadley Sales from Mrs. Stolen, and Bradley Hawkins for personal best from Mrs. Stolen. Naveen Santiago Garcia for personal best from Mrs. Stolen, and Eli Capecci for personal best from Mrs. Uckman in speech. Jesus De Leon Paredes, personal best from Mrs. Storms, as well as Paisley Hawkins for perseverance, Mrs. Elam, and Stephen Riley for responsibility from Mrs. Reichert, and let's see, Roberta Pippinger for personal best from Mrs. Uckman, and Baylor Forth twice for Mrs. Sheets' class for phonics. That is simply an amazing job. So that is page one. Let's turn the page. Jackson Stockdale for personal best, Mrs. Elam. These are all Elams. Claire Carls, Hadley Fouch twice. Ross Milner for personal best. Isla Tomei from Mrs. Elam's class for active listening. Annie Holt and Addie DeVault. Judah the Giant Moody for Mrs. Elam's class. Abby Burnett for effort from Mrs. Storms. Gabe Perrette for Mrs. Stolen for responsibility. Mrs. Storms has Gabe Perrette as well for personal best. Addie Pippinger for effort for Mrs. Storms, not once but twice. Olivia Dutton for effort. She's been working really hard on her reading. Clark Beckstroth for perseverance and Mrs. DeFries, as well as Turner Mosley. And Cooper Rowe. Way to go, Cooper Rowe. That rhymes. Way to go, Cooper Rowe. Let's turn the page. Blakely Irvin for Mrs. These are all sheets. For effort, 1, 2, 3 times. Daphne Haywood, 1, 2, 3 times for effort. Hartley Koenig, 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Cade Kennedy, 4 times for personal best. Cohen Harold, personal best twice. Way to go, Cohen. Dean Cooper for personal best. Cooper Beck for effort, not once, but twice. Super job on that. Got to write down that I read this. Andrew Burnett for kindness from Mrs. Burke, as well as Warner Dalton for integrity from Mrs. Burke. Bailey Sater for personal best from Mrs. Stolen, as well as Emmett Paget for Mrs. Stolen. Lincoln Kessler for effort. Clayton Vessels for personal best for Mrs. Sheets. Sophie for Mrs. Sheets' class. Sophie Delp for effort twice. Nora Cox twice for efforts. Wade Cokert 3 times for Mrs. Sheets for personal best. Levi Fast and Izzy Summerfield. 1, 2, 3 times for Izzy, and Baylor Forth again for efforts. Super job once again. All right, let's turn the page. Emmett Powell for effort from Mrs. Storms. Moses Mitchell for Mrs. Stolen. Jarius Carell for Mrs. Stolen. Allie Burnett twice for effort. Kinsley Colbrith and Sawyer Wielden. Mrs. Tilley's class, effort and personal best. Heath Hurleman for Mrs. Uckman for effort, as well as Anthony Valdez Cruz and William Corrado. McCrae Kaiser for effort for Mrs. Storms. Nora Gamble for effort. Chloe Hughes for personal best. Ed Doing the Right Thing for Mrs. Downham. Bradley Hawkins for effort for Mrs. Marks. Alma De Leon Paredes for Mrs. Stolen for personal best. Landry Sheets for kindness from Mrs. Burke. And Jesus Benavides for perseverance from Mrs. Burke. Great job. Are we done yet? No, we're not. Cave and Stone, not once but twice from Mrs. Oakley. Kai Oakley for effort 1, 2, 3 times from Mrs. Storms and Mrs. Tilly. Maddie Livingston for Mrs. Tholen. Laura Cochran for effort for Mrs. Uckman. Jace Downham. Gannon Fisher for personal best. Olivia Dutton again for Mrs. Storms. Madeline Slaughterback for personal best for Mrs. Tholen, as well as Dawson Diskin for Mrs. Storms. Neil Brown for personal best for Mrs. Oakley, not once but twice. Tolson Stroud for effort. Audrina Hallis for personal best for Mrs. Tholen, as well as Elia Griffith, personal best twice. Parker Fry and Leyland Fuller. Super job. Some great job from Mrs. Tholen. We're getting those sight words figured out. Presley Hallis for effort for Mrs. Reichert, as well as Jovi Martin. Clara Keaton for Mrs. Early's class. Josie Applebaum for Mrs. Storms' class for effort, as well as Avon Ryan and Lincoln Kessler for Mrs. Storms and Mrs. Early. Ross Milner for initiative for Mrs. Elam. Hannah Isaacs for perseverance for Mrs. Vaughn, as well as Oliver Cornell, not once but twice, personal best and effort for Mrs. Early. Mrs. Early has Stassi Strickler and Bella and Brantley Reed, all for active listening and personal best. And Oakley Jackson for effort, not once but twice. Mrs. Uckman, Oakley Jackson for effort. And Garrett Sipple. Way to go, Garrett, for Mrs. Early's class for effort. Kate Kennedy for effort for Mrs. Sheets. Avery Farrell for perseverance for Mrs. Vaughn. Elia Allen for Mrs. Stars for effort. And Levi Fast for Mrs. Sheets. Super job. Way to go. Are we done? We are not. Evelyn Romanley, personal best for Mrs. Tholen. Hunter Koenig for Mrs. Sheets' class for effort. Eli Hammond for cooperation for Mrs. Elam. Izzy Summerfield for effort for Mrs. Sheets. Rowan Guesswine for Mrs. Reicher's class. And Cooper Bainsden for personal best. Mrs. Storm says Jesus Benavida Paredes for effort for Mrs. Storms and Daphne Haywood. Blakely Irvin for personal best for Mrs. Sheets. Emma Coleman, Nora Cox, and Sophie Delp for personal best. Noah Henninger for effort. Sophia Mendez for Mrs. Ferger, and Maddie Lowry for initiative. Mary Gardner for initiative. Stephen Riley for effort. Hadley Fausch for courage. And Sadie Trader for initiative and responsibility. Way to go, my friend Sadie. Are we done? Let's see. We are done. So, great job. Keep up the good work on those life skills. They're paying off. And Mr. Pinto and all your teachers are proud of you.